Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Lancaster Psychology Research Showcase seminar. My name is Agata, and I'll be the host today. And we have Dr. Marina Bazhydai, who will talk about babies and how they seek information from others when they don't know but know who to ask. And just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So the talk will run for 30 minutes, and then we will have 30 minutes of Q&A. Hopefully everything will run smoothly, but of course, if anything goes wrong, then please bear with us. We'll try to keep things running. During the talk, you can post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will publish them as they come in. If you like a particular question and you would like it answered, then you can give it a thumbs up. So I'll do my best to ask the most popular questions first. Hopefully we'll be able to answer all of them, but we will see how much time we have and how many questions come in. Finally, you can turn on subtitles if you click on the CC button, but they're generated automatically, so they might not be perfect, but if that's something you would like, then feel free to use that option. I think that covers it, so I think now I will give the floor to Marina. Okay, there you go.
Hello, everyone. So yes, my name is Marina Bazhydai. I am a lecturer at Lancaster University in developmental psychology. And so unsurprisingly, my talk today will be about babies and developmental processes. So specifically, I will talk about the origins of active learning through seeking information from other people. So I'll highlight several developmental psychology studies that show that even before infants can ask questions verbally, before they can pose those questions, when they are uncertain about something and when not able to find out for themselves, infants have the means to actively communicate with other people, and specifically with people who are more knowledgeable, so that they can gain information from them. But before I get to the cute baby pictures and cute baby videos that show these amazing abilities to seek information from others, let's consider some of the experiences that are familiar to each of us, adults. So in our daily lives, not only children, but ourselves, we often encounter these situations that put us in a state of uncertainty. So I'm talking about informational rather than emotional experiences when we are perplexed or uncertain or generally sort of in a state of, I don't know, but I need to know kind of mental state. So in other words, I'm curious about something in the world and I need to find that information. And so such state of uncertainty can take many forms, many different scenarios. So it may include like events that defy the natural laws of physics and put us in a state of surprise. Sort of how did he do it, where did it go, sort of situations, as I've depicted here with the help of POSC. Or false claims that are provided by previously reliable sources. Maybe some general informational uncertainty, like getting some counterintuitive claims that are hard to believe, but may be presented as true or convincing to some. Other situations include lack of valid and lack of timely information or informational vacuum, as they say, such that what happened during the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. But just generally a knowledge gap between the known and the unknown, or being asked questions that one cannot answer and doesn't have the answer for. So all of these types of scenarios in our daily adult lives apply to children and even infants' experiences, but in a different way, in a different contents. And this is why I find it really, really interesting to study the origins of the very early manifestations of these cognitive abilities. So young children also experience situations of uncertainty when it comes to learning about the world. And so maybe something where they are not sure what is true and what is false in available information that's been discovered or provided to them. And so the key to the to unlocking the knowledge about the world can lie in seeking information independently, so kind of independent discovery process, or actually seeking information from others, so those people who are deemed more knowledgeable, readily available, and willing to share the knowledge that that they have with others. So as you can see, I'm already starting to portray infants in sort of actively learning, eager to discover and eager to grow their knowledge base. So to gain information and to relieve the state of uncertainty when they encounter it, infants and adults could rely on kind of two sources of information. So it could be some kind of independent learning, so seeking information without asking others, without others' help. Or it could be social learning, so it's actively involving others in information gain. And both strategies are effective. Both strategies are actively used by infants, and I can also, I hope that you can see that adults use them as well. So think Google for independent, and maybe university lecture with a Q&A for the social sides of the knowledge acquisition. And so just to unpack it a little bit on what specifically it may look like in infancy, we have this widely used phrase, children are little scientists, and what we mean by that is we describe a child who actively engages with the physical environment. It's the child who kind of seemingly makes, forms a scientific hypothesis and maybe draws some inferences based on what they have discovered. And they do it in a day-to-day kind of exploration and experimentation with objects or situations that are normal to them in daily life. So they kind of gather statistical knowledge about maybe a certain project or certain situations or set of objects or animals, and then they use that knowledge to shape their independent learning. Now, of course, on the other side of the learning process, the social learning, we can call children little anthropologists. They're very sensitive to what's happening with other people around them, and start to develop these strategies to achieve the information gain through other, or as we say, social partners. So infants actively engage others and even selectively choose the best sources of knowledge. And this is really the purpose of and focus of my talk today. So obviously a rather obvious strategy that would come to mind would be just ask a question if you are uncertain in terms of social information seeking, social information gathering, right? So I'm talking about various situations where infants and children are not sure what's going on, too much information, maybe it's kind of abundance of information, or those other scenarios that I've briefly presented. And of course, anyone of you who's ever talked to a child or any child in your life who can pose a question, you would know that they do ask a lot of questions indeed. By some estimates, about 100 questions per day, others say double that. And the questions contents range from all kinds of situations. So they could be not only just seeking information specifically through the questions, but they could be seeking attention or permission or help or clarification. So the contents may change, the questions are being asked. One thing that is kind of clear and obvious, when in doubt, you can ask a question, especially if you have those knowledgeable, willing, and available others who can give you the information you're after and help you resolve the uncertainty that you've encountered. But not all children are able to ask questions, so we're getting to the infants here in a moment. Just on the question asking, as adults, we also ask questions, and I thought I'll have this little scenario that made me smile just recently.
Thank you very much. Thank you. How's that? I was just as if you are enjoying it. Yes, definitely.
Here's a question. Are you supposed to be looking as we were enjoying ourselves? Was that an information-seeking question, or was it motivated by some other goal? Jokes aside, of course. For example, this is happening in Eden project in front of a rather remarkable structure, a biodome. And imagine a 5-year-old child who is facing this, who probably would have asked a question here, such as what are those in amazement, or what's inside, for example, because that's something that they've encountered and probably don't have much prior knowledge about. But a baby, the age that we are focusing for this talk, may not have the communicative means to ask a question just yet. So if the question is not posed, do we assume that babies are unable or don't have the cognitive capacity to actually pose a question? Or do they not experience the uncertainty, or are they just not able to express it? So all these questions come to mind, right? So could we try to look for developmentally available behaviors that may be indicative of information seeking? And really briefly, another viral video that you might have seen, I'm just using here, it's not part of the research, but I'm using it here to convince you that pre-linguistic babies have the communicative capacities to start engaging in a proto-conversation, or handle the proto-conversations. Oops. So just a brief clip here.
They need to work on that, right? Yes. Okay. Did you understand it though? No. Okay. All right. Oh, not this one. This one. Now.
Just to be clear, this baby is not actually speaking or saying words. They're babbling, but a conversation is happening, and this goes on and on, and it's quite cute. So before infants can actually pose a question verbally, we can look at their non-verbal communicative behaviors, because we know so little about the developmental origins of information seeking. And among such behaviors are pointing and social referencing. Pointing is something that infants start to do towards the end of their first year of life, or a bit later. And it's a well-studied nonverbal signaling behavior that infants use quite actively for several reasons, with several intentions, one of which being to request an object, something that's out of reach, or to share attention on an object or a situation that's happening at a distance, for example. But in addition to these goals, infants could use pointing to request information, specifically to obtain new knowledge. And so I wanted to mention this seminal study on this topic of infants' information-seeking pointing, which demonstrated that the goal of pointing could extend beyond sharing just attention, but actually obtaining information. So this is how it worked, and this is just an illustration from the study itself. You can see the schematic here. This is the infant sitting on parents' caregiver's lap, and the experimenter is sitting across from them, and the experimenter presents some objects on the table and provides names for these familiar objects. So imagine the experimenter putting a ball in front of them and then actually gives it a name and says, oh, look, this is a ball. That would be a knowledgeable experimenter. So some infants met an experimenter who presented themselves as a knowledgeable person. And another group of infants went through the same exact procedure, but the person they've been communicating with, they've been playing with in this study, was presenting themselves as a not knowledgeable person. So when there was a ball on the table, that person, instead of saying, look, this is a ball, would mislabel it and say, look, this is a car, for example, or a duck. And that happened several times, so that the infant got familiarized with who is in front of them, are they knowledgeable or not. And then came a test phase of this procedure, where behind the experimenter there was a little shelf opening, and discreetly another person has put a new object on that shelf. So the experimenter is facing the child, something is placed on the shelf, And then when the infant noticed that a new object has appeared, they sometimes would point to that object. And when that happened, the experimenter who was knowledgeable will turn back, look at the object and give it a name. Oh, look, this is a MODI or something, a new word for the new object that the infant doesn't know. The previously ignorant experimenter also turned around in response to your point, but their information provision was had some cues of uncertainty. So they would say something like, look, what is this? I think it's a MODI, something like that. So long story short, the result of this study was that infants who interacted with a demonstrably knowledgeable experimenter, they pointed much more, significantly more to these novel objects than infants in another group who interacted with a not knowledgeable, ignorant experimenter, which suggests that the one function of the pointing in infancy is to obtain information from others, and that infants could selectively seek that information from those who they perceive to be more competent. And then since this study, a few more have kind of cemented the result. And so collectively they demonstrate that infants not only distinguish the level of knowledge that their adults that they meet have, but they also use pointing to ask for information selectively from such people. So they have been shown to be sensitive to when the adults were informative or ignorant, or when they were actually providing information, or engaging with the child's request, but not providing information. So acknowledging the request, but not being informative in that sense, rather than providing wrong information, as in the previous study. Another important thing about pointing is that infants who have been shown to point to the object and obtain information, obtain a label for this object, for example, from a knowledgeable experimenter, they later actually remembered this information better, though. So that led to formulating the so-called pointing advantage, meaning that infants use this communicative behavior to create kind of a more favorable conditions for their effective learning for themselves. They point to something, they obtain information, then they better remember it, as opposed to not asking for the information, not seeking it, but just passively receiving it. That's all great. These are very convincing studies focusing on pointing. But pointing, as I mentioned, emerges towards the end or just after the first birthday of the child. So the question is, what happens before that? So do infants have the cognitive capacity? Do they have the behavioral skills to actively seek information from others before they have mastered this pointing at around 12 months? So one candidate behavior for that is called social referencing. And this has been classically studied in a paradigm that's called the visual cliff paradigm, and that's what I have an illustration for here. So essentially the infant here is facing a visual drop-off. It's a completely safe environment. It's just a plexiglass. So the infant is placed on one side where they can crawl towards their caregiver, and the caregiver is on the other side of the apparatus. And when the infant approaches the visual drop-off, they would often generate a look. They would spontaneously look at the adult who is waiting for them on the other side. And that has been shown in very, very different conditions, different studies with different people. Sometimes it's a caregiver, sometimes it's a stranger. But one thing is common across all of the scenarios is that the infant is making that social look to seek information in this emotionally uncertain context, to cross or not to cross, potentially unsafe, potentially threatening a scenario in a way. But infants are receptive to the emotional messages that the caregiver gives them. So in the classical study, caregiver would be asked to either be positive and encouraging, to kind of give those signals to the child, that it's safe to cross, or they would be giving some kind of negative or discouraging signals. And infants would take those signals in and use them in making a decision whether or not to continue crawling. Again, this is a completely safe environment, so it's just meant to elicit this behavior. In fact, other scenarios have been used to look at social referencing in infants in emotionally or kind of potentially scary situations. For example, some studies have played the sound of a barking dog to the infant, or infant would meet a stranger, and then they would use social referencing to check in with a caregiver. Or in some scenarios, they face a self-propelling dinosaur toy or some other kind of potentially unsettling toy, not too scary, but that's moving towards them. So this line of research has been extremely informative to help us understand how infants are able to seek information from other people that they would see as competent in this domain of emotional uncertainty. So obviously, a caregiver being referenced before making a decision whether it's safe or not to save is one such example of a competent social partner. But this is only one type of uncertainty that infants face. So what has been interesting to me and others is whether infants would use social referencing in information rather than emotional uncertainty. So information uncertainty that is not potentially threatening and that doesn't elicit this this kind of fight or flight response. There are several recent studies that looked at that, and they found that social referencing is also used in scenarios that infants find unexpected, or this is called a violation of expectation, when something surprising or unusual happens. In situations that when infants can obtain information from others about, for example, a hidden object that they don't know where it has been hidden, so they would look at the person who they think knows or may know, or looking at someone who may give them a label for the new object. And some other scenarios that I'll actually refer to in just a few slides one more time, called referential uncertainty. Also, there are studies where infants detect that the situation is humorous, and that led them to generate social referencing looks as well. So what unites these scenarios is that others' information, the messaging that is coming from other adults that the infant refers to, whether emotional messages or informational messages, they serve to reduce infants' uncertainty in the world, to fill that kind of information gap. So what is this called, or where is the ball hidden, or how does this work? And that goes beyond the is it safe or not safe. Okay, so in one study in our lab, we've investigated the role of social referencing in a situation where infants' expectations are violated. And what we meant by that specifically here is that the infant is just facing the screen, and on the screen they see familiar objects or animals, first hidden and then revealed. And the caregiver here is instructed to either provide congruent or incongruent label. So incongruent label being false, basically. Instead of calling a cat, they would call it's something else, a dog. Congruent labels, such as saying, well, look, this is a cat, or providing no labels at all. And just a brief clip of what this kind of trial looked like. Something like that here. The caregiver didn't say it was a cat, as she said it was something, I think she said it was a dog or something. It's actually randomly presented, so I'm not sure what exactly she's been saying here. So infants would experience these events, and we are interested in social referencing looks and whether they are selective, specific to the situations of uncertainty or not. So again, we're investigating kind of informational uncertainty that comes in two ways. One is that a reliable person, the caregiver, all of a sudden provides incorrect information. And second being is that there is a label object mismatch. The cat is not a cat all of a sudden. And does that lead to a social referencing, a look being generated? And in fact, we did find that you can see on the graph here, in the incongruent condition, the proportion of social referencing is significantly higher than it is in the congruent or no label conditions. So infants selectively reference caregivers in response to this uncertainty. So social referencing can be viewed in this study as a reactive communication to an informational uncertainty. In fact, in a follow-up experiment, we also found that when what caregivers have been saying has been kind of mixed, sometimes it was true, sometimes it was false, the same result has been found, is that infants are sensitive to that and they reference them more when they face this uncertainty. So collectively, we see that social referencing is not just for emotional uncertainty, it is something has something to do in response to informational uncertainty. But I was also curious whether social referencing can be used actively to interrogate or to seek information rather than just respond to informational uncertainty. So to actively solicit information from people, to ask them that question before they're able to do it verbally. And so that led to the next study, where we asked whether these pre-verbal infants would selectively seek information from more knowledgeable adults when facing referential uncertainty. And what we mean by that is the situation where infants see two unfamiliar objects, these two things they've never seen before, and then they are asked a question, an essentially impossible question: which one is the blanket? Clearly, there's no way to answer this. There's no reference point here. Objects are new. The question is coming out of nowhere, and importantly, there's no way to find out which one is the blanket independently. So, essentially, one way to gather the answer is to ask a more knowledgeable person, someone who can provide an answer. So this is what the study looked like. We've invited infants to laboratory. They have been fitted with a head-mounted eye tracking device on their head, so that gives us very rich looking data from where they're looking. Caregiver has been sitting across the infant, and then infants are introduced to two experimenters. And so one of the experimenters is playing the role of the informant. Another experiment is playing the role of a non-informant. And I guess just to mention, sometimes the same person would play a different role and they switch sides between participants, so that we are not measuring just this particular person or that particular person. So what did the informant do? The informant was reliably providing information about objects. Some objects were familiar, other objects were new, and the informant would always give the information about it. They would give a label about these objects. The non-informant was equally engaging, equally nice, making eye contact with the child, but was just not informative. And I'll show you just a short clip of what it looked like when we were familiarizing infants to kind of who is who before our test trial.
What is this? Look, this is a book. Oh, is it? Look at your book. Oh, wow. Oh, wow, a book. I like your book. I don't know what this is. Look, you've got a book. This is nice. I like your book. I like this.
So it's important to note here is that the caregiver was the only person who would present the objects, the toys, take away the objects, and pose questions. And you can see behind the child, we have a screen that kind of guided the caregiver as to what to say, when to say, what to put on, and so on. A huge thank you for all the caregivers. Maybe some of you are watching us now, who have been such great helpers in this experiment. It wouldn't be possible without you. The experimenters were very limited in what they were doing. Essentially, informant would have to have a list of phrases that she would say to establish herself as knowledgeable. Non-informant would have a list of phrases that would establish herself as not knowledgeable. And then came, so once that has kind of been established, and we could presume that the infant has encoded who is who, then came a crucial phase in the experiment, a test phase where that referential uncertainty takes place. So again, the caregiver places two completely novel objects. That's something that the infant hasn't seen, and then the caregiver poses that question that the caregiver herself is unable to answer. She doesn't know which one is a new object. When that question is posed, there's a moment of 15 seconds actually of silence when no one is speaking. And of course, we're measuring infants' social referencing. So here's a clip of that as well for you.
Which one is the toner?
And of course, this is a short clip, but it hopefully gives you a good illustration of what has been happening. So the infant here is the infant camera view, actually, again, a short view when it's silence, no one speaking, and then the infant is looking and choosing who to look at. So in this situation of high uncertainty, and again, this is not emotional, it's informational, it's not like the visual cliff kind of uncertainty. And when the child is not able to get the information they want to get by themselves, infant actually face this dilemma, I don't know, but who do I ask, in a sense? And just a few words, the caregiver, again, doesn't have the knowledge, but remember, the caregiver is also the person sitting right across from the child and putting the toys, taking the toys away. So, of course, there were some looks at the caregiver, but we were interested in who do they choose, infants choose to look at, the informant or non-informant specifically. And so we did measure their proportion of their looks and also their first looks at the informant throughout the experiment at different phases. And what we found in a nutshell, I guess, is that they did look at the informant more so than the non-informant. And crucially, they did it only when they needed the answer to the impossible question, but not throughout the procedure. So here on the left is infants' proportion of looks when they were just being familiarized to who is who. So they actually look at chance to informant and non-informant. When it comes to test, the proportion of looks at the informant, who is at the top of my graph, increases statistically significantly. And that also was the case for their very first looks as an extra measure of this. So the conclusion from the study is that infants who are still preverbal, they generate these social looks in situations of uncertainty. And they do it to actively and selectively seek information from people who are more knowledgeable than others and more knowledgeable than themselves. So they're not passively waiting necessarily. They have this ability to actively seek and participate in that knowledge exchange process. I guess my take-home message overall for the active social learning is that, infants seek information from the best source, and they do that in situations of various situations of uncertainty. I've only presented a few studies to give you a glimpse into this line of research, and then they take this what's called interrogative stance, the ability to query others for information is actually communicatively available to them at their developmental stage, even before they're able to ask questions verbally. And here I just wanted to, I guess, kind of my key message as to why it's interesting to do research with babies on these kinds of matters is actually to help us better understand not only the cognitive roots and developmental trajectory of when and how we as humans start to seek information, but also sort of how do we navigate the information society that we live in, a society where information is the most important commodity. We seek true knowledge in the world. The information society bombards us with abundance of messages, of mixed messages, and that challenges us really to navigate this world, to sift through multiple sources of information, make sense of the world. And of course, as adults, we have capacities to critically evaluate available facts. We have capacities to seek supporting evidence, to evaluate expert opinions, but also to exert trust in sources and opinions that we find as reliable, as that we kind of choose to believe in. So yeah, I'm motivated to understand this process in early development. Of course, infants are born into this information age. They don't choose to come into it, but we can try to see how they do it very early on. And what does facing uncertainty look for them, and how does looking for reliable sources look for them? Yeah. So I'll actually skip through a few of these slides, which talks about my ongoing research, and just end with a quote from Lev Vygotsky, that knowledge is a product of interaction between individual and the environment, and that's something that we do holistically. Basically, it's always a combination of independent processes and social processes that allow us to construct what's happening. So it's in this uncertain world, when bombarded with information, infants have very basic but early developing cognitive mechanisms for quickly acquiring information and benefiting from all the strategies that they can, independent and social learning strategies alike. So when they don't know, they know when and who and how to ask. With that, I would like to acknowledge, first of all, Lancaster area families who have made this research possible and came to the lab before we closed for pandemic. Members of the Lancaster University Baby Lab where research was conducted, and everyone who worked there, and of course the psychology department. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to hear your questions. Please pose them verbally.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. We have a couple of questions, so I'm going to jump right in. So the first few are about the methods of the different studies that you explained. So first of all, in the pointing study, which one that was that? I think the first one that you explained. How did infants know who was a knowledgeable experimenter and who was not? So can you explain that again?
Yeah. So the experimenter first would interact with objects that were that the experimenter would put on the table. So they will take something like a familiar object and be like, "Oh, that's a phone," and "Oh, look at that, that's a pen," or something of this sort. Very similar to kind of the last study I've talked about. This is kind of a go-to method where the experimenter just labels things, labels objects or toys that are familiar to the child to show that they know what they are. The non-knowledgeable, non-informative experimenter, on the other hand, in that particular study was a false labeler. So they would take something familiar but be like, "This is a duck," or something of this sort. But yeah, it can be manipulated in several ways. So in my study, the most recent one I've showed, the last one I've showed you, we chose not to mislabel objects to present the adult who's not knowledgeable, but rather to say, "Oh, I don't know what this is," to kind of show that ignorance of lack of knowledge.
Yeah, so the assumption was basically that the infants already knew the names and they could tell that the names were not right for the assistant.
Yes. And that assumption is supported by research. It's not a wild assumption. So we would those researchers as well would use the norms for what we know on average that children do and know at that age, but also pre-test the parents usually to ask whether the child knows about this word or not. Mm-hmm.
Okay, now this is an interesting question. Do infants with autism show a delay or even absence in pointing or social referencing?
Yes, and it's a bit of a mixed literature, I guess, on that. In these particular paradigms that I've described in my talk, have, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know of studies that have used these paradigms in children with children with autism or at risk for autism. Bearing in mind that the diagnosis for autism, again, this is not my area of expertise by no means at all, but diagnosis for autism usually is not possible or doesn't take place in the first or second year. So we can only assume, or we can have kind of signs of a child possibly developing autism later. So I hope I'm answering the question. So pointing, social referencing are the social signaling behaviors that may be disrupted in autism, but specifically these studies are not allowing us to very clearly say that this is the case. A bit of a mixed response here. I'm not an expert on this.
Yeah, that's really interesting, but I suppose it's, like you said, it's too early to know for sure.
Infants could be at risk for autism at this age by virtue of having a family history of autism, and so they could be at risk. And this is how most studies with infants are conducted, is that a group of infants who may be at risk because they have a sibling with autism or other family history would be studied, but then they need them to be followed longitudinally as they grow to see whether the diagnosis was actually kind of whether they have been diagnosed with autism or not. And by then, pointing and social referencing are not as such salient behaviors anymore, because by then other communicative behaviors are more important.
Okay, so the next question is about the method of yours. Well, not the method, about your study. If the informed person is not available, would infants prefer to seek information from an ignorant person, i.e. fake news person, or would they rather have no information and just figure it out on their own? What do you think?
Thank you. That's a great study idea. Should we collaborate on making that happen? I can only speculate about the answer. There's no clear study by so and so that I can refer to, or by myself. Infants and older children, 3 to 5 year old children, are often studied in similar paradigms where one person presented to them is knowledgeable, another person is not knowledgeable, or competent or not competent, or informative or not so much informative. And so the gradation, the granularity of that knowledgeability can be studied in different shapes and forms. So that body of research collectively does tell us that children and infants would still prefer to learn from someone. They would still take information that comes even from a person who is not necessarily knowledgeable. So that kind of give them, especially when there is not an alternative in the kind of artificial setup that we have created for them in the laboratory environment, in the experiment. If there's only one person who's not knowledgeable, they will still use the information that they've given them and seek information. But I guess I'm talking about slightly older studies, because not that many studies have been done with very young infants under the age of 1.5 maybe. So yes, they are willing and actively seeking and willing to accept information from even the person who's not the best information source. And this is actually kind of why I've created a paradigm where both are available at the same time, rather than only one person, only one experimenter interacts with the child, like in the pointing study. I hope I didn't confuse that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, the next question is, are the incongruent labels always known words to the infants? And if so, then could they think that the adult is being silly rather than ignorant when they mislabel something?
Can you read the start of the question again? Is the incongruent?
Is it always known to the infant? So
no, known to the infant. It's been done several ways. Again, I'm only giving a snapshot of this paradigm, that paradigm. Sometimes the unfamiliar objects are mislabeled. Sometimes familiar objects are mislabeled. Sometimes unfamiliar objects are presented and labeled, but when the experimenter has kind of a history of being ignorant or incorrect. So I guess it's been studied in various ways, again, with slightly older children most of the time. Sorry, maybe I forgot the core of the question, actually.
Basically, I guess it makes sense that, for example, when you showed this person who was saying that something is a dog when it's a cat,
mm-hmm.
Could the child just be like, oh, that's funny because it's a cat, instead of being confused, like,
yeah,
you know?
Yes, it's a open question what actually the child is thinking. And there are studies of children, of infants of this age and even younger age, that show that they are sensitive to kind of humorous situations. And by humorous situations, those researchers have presented, like, I don't know, instead of putting a spoon to the mouth, they would put a spoon, they take a spoonful of food, but instead of going to the mouth, they'll go to the ear. And infants do find it funny and then make those looks. So actually, I guess my answer is I don't know. And I don't know who to ask whether they interpret these mislabeling events as funny or not. We definitely saw kind of anecdotally, so in some of the infants who took part in the study, that they laughed. But it wasn't a behavior that was consistent, because obviously we're looking on kind of average across all the infants. So it's not something that we've detected as a behavior. And I guess laughing could be one indicator that they treat it as a humorous event. Yeah, there's more research to be done.
Okay, there's actually a question that says, if you have time, could you briefly tell us what your ongoing studies are about? And we do have 10 minutes, so if you want to,
okay,
tell us.
Right, so let me just go back in. How do I do that? There's a few things, a few slides I've put together. So this one is actually building on the social referencing study, the one I showed you a clip for with the informant and non-informant. And here we want to see whether infants would expect that the same person who was knowledgeable about one domain of knowledge, like labels, like knowing what things are called, would actually be also expected to be knowledgeable about another domain. And here we are contrasting labels and functions of objects. So the same experimenter who would have shown to the child that, look, I know about object labels and I name them properly, when the situation is about functions of an object, how does a completely new object work, would the infant prefer to also turn to them, to look at them if they're facing that uncertainty about how something works. So here we have kind of two options that could happen cognitively for the child, is that one is that they could perceive a person as a kind of know-it-all, the main general competence, like if the person knows about this, then they must know about something else. Or alternatively, they could expect that the person only knows about labels, so that it stays only within the same domain. So we have set up the same kind of paradigm where we'll be looking at who the child decides to reference in times of uncertainty when these two domains, labels and functions, are crossed. In another study with my very talented and highly motivated research assistants at the moment, we are looking at infants' spontaneously generated communicative bits for information. So it's analysis of the data that has been collected in children's homes, and there were just kind of videos of infant child caregiver play. And the same children have been studied longitudinally, so they've been filmed at 11 months, and then again at 18 months, at 24 months, and at 30 months. And just kind of playing. So what we're doing, we've developed a novel coding scheme to kind of extract those behaviors that are indicative of information seeking, starting with nonverbal behaviors such as social referencing and pointing, but also going to their the questions that they ask as well. So it's going to be kind of a long-term project. There's a lot of work to do, but it's really fascinating, and looking forward to the results on that. We still have time. In another line of research, we've actually looked at physiological arousal that happens as the child is facing this kind of informational uncertainty. So we've measured heart rate and skin conductance response of babies by placing their this research quality wristband. Actually, it goes on their leg, or just above the cuff, on the cuff. And so we get whether they are, what happens in their heart rate and skin conductance response as kind of a measures of interest and attention. Yeah, I think that I'll stop here. Any questions about that?
Okay, thanks. We have one more question about the previous part, the first study again. So maybe you can just reiterate the rationale. Why did they lie to the babies about the name of the object in the Begas and Southgate study? Why not just tell them what it is? So I think it's the ignorant experimenter condition that someone's not sure about.
Right. So yes, the idea there, and sort of in my studies as well, is we want to create a situation that is sort of artificially showing the child, look, there are two people. There are different kinds of people in the world. Some who are knowledgeable and others who are not. And so one way to create this state, hopefully mental state of a child, that look, this person is completely ignorant, or gives me wrong information, is to do that. So again, we don't know exactly what the child is thinking. We can only infer that from their behaviors that happen after such scenarios, such manipulation. So in that study, the main behavior that was looked at was pointing, and it was found that when children who were in the group of knowledgeable person who interacted with the knowledgeable person, the one who provided proper words for names, words for objects, infants pointed more when the new object appeared. So remember, there was a new object appearing behind the experimenter, and infants actually pointed at that. And that was interpreted that infants expected that object to be also labeled by a person who was more knowledgeable previously. If they're more knowledgeable previously, when something new happens, they probably know what it's called, so they will tell me. And so they pointed and got that answer. In the group where experimenter was not knowledgeable, when the object appeared, infants pointed less, significantly less, statistically significantly less. And that again was interpreted as maybe, hey, maybe I shouldn't really be asking for information from this person who doesn't seem to know about even obvious things. Why would I ask that same person about new things? I hope that the logic is a bit more clear.
Yeah, I think that's pretty comprehensive. Now, can you tell us more about infant eye tracking? How do you do it, and what data do you get?
That's a big question, I guess. We get the data of where they are looking, so the very precise crosshair location of the look. So I guess I can put that slide with this one here. So we see that it's called a crosshair, the two blue lines. This gives us exact location of the look, and that's calibrated to each individual infant before the study actually commences, because we need to make sure that what they're looking at in the whole space of the room is matching what we see on the video then, because of the positioning of the eye tracker. So it gives us a very detailed location, but also the length of the look. It's called the fixation. So how long they fixate on each of the points. And then we have some flexibility here before the experiment to define the areas that we are, this is a bit too much, it keeps on going. We define the areas of interest. So for example, we could define an area of a face of the experimenter or the caregiver's face or particular objects. So whenever they look at that object, we will get the data that they have. And so then we can manipulate that data in many different ways.
So actually, this is a question from me. So actually, it's not like the typical adult eye tracking. It's a camera, and then do you have to code it that they looked left or right?
By typical adult, you mean the stationary eye tracker, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It works because it's not a screen based, so it works as a typical eye tracker in terms of mechanics, technology. But okay. But in terms of because there's more freedom as to where to look, as they can be looking at the ceiling or elsewhere, right? It's not limited by the screen when it's an eye tracking that only works when your participants look at the screen. Here they can look anywhere, so obviously you need to limit what kind of information you're getting, like what kind of data you're getting. So this this manual with this particular head-mounted eye tracking set, there's manual coding involved, but it's automated to a degree. I'm happy to show you when we come back to the lab, Agatha.
That would be great, because I imagine that just sitting there and writing 5 seconds looking right would be a bit of a
no, it's not that.
Yeah,
it's that manual. It's a bit more manual, a bit more involved, but not to that extent.
Interesting. So I'd love to see that.
We have lots of experts in the lab that we can.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Okay, so I think that's all the questions, and that's all the time that we have. Thanks so much for the interesting talk, and thank you to everyone for asking questions and just being here with us. We have another talk coming up next week. Here is the title. So it's going to be Dr. Patrick May, who will talk about harnessing auditory neuroscience for green energy production. Very intriguing. This is going to be at the same time. So please join us, and you can follow us on social media as well and watch these seminars on YouTube. So that's it for today. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.